Hi, welcome to Challenge JP. My name is Jacek, and today I'm going to show you how to create a project cost allocation and profitability dashboard in Microsoft Power BI.
Before we go into any details, let's look at the completed dashboard. So what you can see here is a completed Power BI file with 3 report pages. The first page, profit and loss, shows a monthly breakdown of revenue, direct expenses, project staff costs, any allocated overheads, then the total cost, total profit, and billable hours. And then the second table shows the same numbers, but this time broken on the project basis. To the right, you see the slicers that allow you to select the allocation basis. So this can be hours or revenue. The year, select a client, select a specific project. The next page, staff contribution, show employee breakdown with billable hours, total hours, utilization percentage, the revenue contribution of each employee, this employee cost, which then translates into revenue per hour, and then employee cost per hour, and then eventually allows us to create a gross margin calculation. And then finally, the forecast page allows you to see what happens to our project profitability if we change some of the main drivers. And then the graph and the table below shows the impact of those changes. Throughout this course, I will be referring to my web tutorial, and you can find a link to this page in the description of this video. And this tutorial contains all the steps that we'll use in order to create our dashboard, along with the data sources and DAX measures. So let's have a look at the contents of our course. So we'll start with loading the data into Microsoft Power BI. Then we'll link this table to create relationships and to create our data model. Then we'll create some basic metrics and DAX measures that will allow us to allocate overheads and general costs, calculate staff costs, and then overall profitability of the project. And then finally, we'll move to building additional DAX measures that, along with those parameters, will allow us to create our forecast page. As you can see, you can also preview the dashboard or download the Power BI file along with the DAX measures and the data sources. So let's go to our step 1, where we're going to load the data and then create our data model. First of all, I'm going to use 4 sample data sources. Our first data set is an accounting P&L, which shows the overall profit and loss of the company with all the revenues and expense lines. Then a second data source consists of information about our employees. Then we have data with timesheets. And then we have our data with expenses that show direct expenses associated with a given project. So to start, I've created an empty Power BI file, which I can use to load our data and create first DAX measures. So to load our first data set, I will go to the Home tab and then click on that Get Data icon. Select the text CSV, which will take me to my data folder where I hold my data sources. And I'm going to select that first file, which is that accounting P&L. I'm going to click on Open. First, I want to have a look at the data in my Power Query editor. So I'm going to click on Transform Data. I can see that my data look okay. So the date column is in a date format, then the accounts category, project and client, also department are in a text format, and then the amount is presented as a number. Before I load the data in, I want to make one transformation. As you can see, my expenses are in negative numbers. So I want to create another column that shows all the amounts as positives. To do that, I'm going to click on the Add Column tab and then select Custom Column icon. I'm going to call the new column amount underscore absolute. And as a formula, I'm going to type in number dot apps. I'm going to open my parentheses and then open a square bracket, which then gives me a list with my column names. I'm going to select the amount and I'm going to close my parentheses. And then after I click OK, you should see that amount absolute column negative. So if I scroll down to the expenses, you see that all the numbers that were negative before are now positive. Now I can go back to my Home tab, click on Close and Apply. And after a few moments, you should see that accounting PL table appearing in our data pane. I'm now ready to load another set of data. So let's go to the Get Data again, text CSV, and then this time I'm going to select employees. And then again, before I load it in directly, I want to click on Transform Data just to inspect it in our Power Query editor. You can see that this table contains information such as employee ID, first name, last name, role, department, then the annual base salary, employment type, and then finally some information about the weekly hours, pension, tax rates, and then finally the annual employer cost. All the columns look okay, and I don't need to make any transformation here, so I'm just going to click on Close and Apply. And again, you will see that employees table appearing in the data pane to our right. Let's go back to our Home tab, select again Get Data, Text CSV, and now I can select Expenses. Click on Open. Then again, I'm going to click on Transform Data to open our Power Query editor. Okay, and you can see that this table contains data with our expenses. They're allocated to a specific employee and also a specific project, expense type, and then the last column shows whether that expense is billable or not. And last but not least, you have in the column with amount. Okay, again, our data look fine. So I'm going to click on close and apply. And then again, you see those expenses table appearing in our data pane to the right. Okay, I'm going to load now the last data set. And now we have our timesheets. Click on open, transform data. So we can open any Power Query editor. We see here, this is the extract from our timesheets that shows the week starting, again, employee ID, project, with the hours that we can break by our employee ID, project, and the task. And then we can also see whether those hours are billable or not. So I'm going to click on close and apply. And now we can also see the timesheets appearing in the data pane to our right. Now, if we go to our Power BI model view, you can see those 4 rectangles representing our tables with the respective fields. So now we want to start linking those tables together. Now, before we do that, I want to create a couple more custom tables that will allow us to put those data on a timeline, as well as add some filters to the dashboards that we'll create later on. So first of all, in order to create a custom table, I'm going to click on that new table icon in our home tab. Again, we're on the model view, and now we can see that table equal appearing in our function or measure bar. So I'm going to go back to my tutorial. And again, you can find a link to this page in the description of this video. And then if I scroll down, you will see that in our step 1C, I have a measure called calendar. So this measure allows me to create a calendar with the date range based on our existing tables, and also some additional columns such as year, month number, quarter, year, month, which will help me create my future DAX measures. So rather than typing this DAX table in, I'm simply going to copy that measure and then go back to my practice sheet, and I'm going to paste it in my measure bar here and then hit enter. You should now see another table called calendar, which is the table we've just created. Before I move on, I still have one task to complete. I need to click on those 3 dots next to my calendar and then select mark as date table. Then make sure you switch it on and then select date as our date column. And now I want to start ordering the tables a little bit. So I'm going to move all the tables with the data to the bottom part of my model view. So I'm going to take that accounting P&L here, expenses next to that, timesheets as well. And I'm going to leave my dimensions tables above them. So those will be the tables that I can use to look up or connect my data together. So I'm going to leave the employees and the calendar table here. And now we can start creating our basic data model. So first I'm going to look at the employees table. And then as you can see, there was one field that is common between my employees table and my expenses and timesheets. Again, as I mentioned before, expenses and timesheets, they refer to the expenses on the number of hours incurred by specific employees. So I'm going to take the employee ID and then drag it over the employee ID in my expenses table first. Make sure that I have cardinality one-to-many, active relationship, and a single cross-filtering direction. Then click on save. And I'm going to do the same thing, but this time with timesheets. So again, I'm going to drag the employee ID from my employees table and then drop it over employee ID with my timesheets. And then again, I'm going to select the one-to-many, active relationship, single cross-filter direction, and click save. Now for my calendar, I'm going to take the date field and drag it and drop it over date in my accounting P&L. And now I'm going to drop that date over a date field in accounting P&L. And again, I have to make sure that there is a cardinality of one-to-many. So the data flows from the calendar table to the accounting P&L. My relationship is active and I have a single cross-filter direction. Click on save. I'm going to do the same with calendar and expenses. So again, I'm going to take the date field from the calendar and then drop it over date in expenses table. Make sure there's one-to-many, single, and active relationship. Click on save. Now in my timesheets, I don't have an explicit date field, but I have that week starting column, which I can also link with my calendar's date. So I'm going to drag that date and then drop it over that week starting field. Make sure you select one-to-many, single, and active relationship. Click on save. And that completes our basic data model. Now, before we move on, I want to create 2 more custom DAX tables that will allow us to filter our clients and projects. So to do that, again, I will go to my home tab, Click again on the new table. Go back to my tutorial. You will see that I have here 2 additional dimensions. So the first dimension, dim projects, create a table with the name of distinct projects by client. Okay, so again, I'm going to just copy that code, go back to my Power BI practice sheet, and then paste that measure in. Click commit or hit enter, and you see that I have that dim project table appearing here on the top. And then I want to go back to my tutorial and copy another dimension. This time there's going to be a table with distinct clients only. Click on the new table and then paste the code, hit enter. I want to now link those 2 tables into our data model. So first of all, I'm going to create a link between the clients and the projects. So I'm going to simply create a connection between dim clients and dim projects table, making sure that again it's one-to-many, single and active. Click on save. And then I want to create relationships between my project field in my dim projects table and the corresponding fields in accounting P&L, expenses and timesheets. So first of all, I'm going to drag this project field from my dim projects table and then drop it over project field in the accounting P&L. Again, make sure it's one-to-many, single and active relationship. Then I'm going to drag the same project field and drop it over a project field in my expenses table. Again, making sure that it's one-to-many, single and active. And then finally, take the same project field and then this time drop it over project in my timesheets. And again, make sure it's one-to-many, single and active. So now with those table relationships and data model in place, I can go back to my web tutorial and start creating our first DAX measures. Okay, before we introduce our first DAX measure, let's go to the report view of our Power BI practice sheet and click Enter Data. This will open up a dialog box that allows us to create a new table. We want to create a table that we'll call a measures table, which will be the repository of our DAX measures. So after typing in the name of the table, click on load, and then you should see that measures table appearing to your right. Right-click on that measures table and then select new measure. You should now see a new measure in our bar. And now let's go back to our web tutorial. And again, you can find a link to that web page in the description of this video. And looking at the step 3, let's copy that total revenue measure. That's the measure that's going to look into our accounting P&L and sum up all the revenues using calculate function, sum, and revenue as our filter. And then we'll paste it in and then hit enter. You should now see that total revenue measure appearing in our measures table. And then the last thing that we want to do, we want to click on that column 1, right click on it, and then select delete from model. And now you should see that measures table on the top with an icon that indicates that that measure stores our calculation. In order to add another measure, let's right click on it again and then select new measure again. Go back to our web tutorial and then copy another measure, this time total direct expenses, which simply sums all the expenses amount from the expenses table. Go back to our practice sheet and then paste it in, hit enter. And now you should see that measure also appearing in our measures table. Now let's go back to our web tutorial again, and then we're going to copy a couple more measures. So now I'm going to copy that total non-direct cost measure. And this measure, again using the calculate and sum functions, will look into all the non-revenues amounts from our accounting P&L table, minus those total direct expenses measure that we've created earlier. Go back to the practice sheet, right click on the measures table, select new measure, and then paste it in, hit enter. Now let's go back again to our web tutorial, and this time we want to create measures that will calculate total hours and billable hours only. So the first measure, total hours, simply looks at the timesheets and sums up all the hours. Go to the practice sheet, right click on the measures table, and then click new measure and paste it in, then enter. And then again, let's go back to our web tutorial and copy that billable hours measure. What this billable hour measures does, using that calculate function again, it looks at the total hours measure, but it filters it only for the billable hours. Right click on the measures table, select new measure, and then again paste it in, hit enter. Those 5 measures will be our base calculations, which we will use in later steps of this tutorial. But for now, let's create our first visual. So we'll go to the Insert tab, then expand that visual gallery and select Matrix from our visuals. You should see that empty matrix. And for now, I just want to create a monthly summary of our revenues and hours using those 5 measures that we just created. So in our rows, I'm going to add a month start field from our calendar table. So that's the table that we created earlier. And then for our values, let's add those 5 calculations that we just created. So I'm going to go to our measures table and then select total revenue, total direct expenses, total non-direct expenses, total hours, and then billable hours. Let's expand our matrix. And then you can already see that we need to change some of the formatting. So I'm going to open my format pane, click on properties, and I'm going to select that month start and choose that month, day, and year format. Now for our measures, we can click on each measure separately and then choose the appropriate formatting. So for example, for the total revenues, let's select dollar and then maybe change the number of decimal points to 0. And then same thing for expenses. And then for the hours, we can just change the decimal places and add that comma as our thousand separator. Same for the billable hours. And that created our very basic matrix with our monthly revenues, direct expenses, non-direct costs, and then the total hours and billable hours. Now, if we go back to our first page of the completed dashboard, you will see here that I have a similar table with a bit more formatting, a couple more calculations. Now, in order to complete this matrix and add those additional calculations, we need to insert additional measures that will allow us to correctly allocate our overheads based on our projects using the hours of revenue as the basis of our allocation. So let's go back to my web tutorial, and then if we scroll down, you should see a section that deals with those DAX measures for cost allocation. So the first measure here, allocated employee cost, fully loaded, first calculates the hourly rate for each employee based on the employee cost in our employees table. So it simply divides the annual employee cost by the number of hours that a given employee works in a year. And then it applies that hourly rate to the number of hours that a given employee works on a given project using that timesheets table that we added earlier. Now below that, you have a measure that allocates those non-direct costs based either on the number of hours spent on a given project or the revenue that this project has generated. So first of all, you will see that we need to create a small table using that DAX new table option that will allow us to create a slicer to select the basis of our allocation, which will be either the hours or the revenue. Then we have a measure that is linked to that allocation selection. If there was no selection made, then the hours is our default value. And then we have a measure here called hours share projects that looks at the number of hours spent on a given project and divides that value by the total number of hours spent on all projects in order to calculate the percentage share of hours spent on a given project. Now, another measure here, revenue share, calculates a percentage contribution of a given project, but this time looking at the total revenues. So again, using that calculate function, and this time the total revenue measure, it looks at the revenue generated by a given project, and then it divides it by the total revenues generated by all of our projects. And then the next measure, allocation share, returns one of the 2 above measures based on that allocation basis selection. Then we have our total salaries. Total salaries simply look at the accounting P&L, our amount absolute that we created earlier, and then it filters that by account column looking on into salaries. And then we have our other non-direct costs, which simply takes those total non-direct costs and excludes total salaries, which will be represented in a separate column. You have also measures with unallocated salaries. Those will be salaries that are not directly attributed to a given project. Here we have a slight revision of our total direct expenses to make sure that we only keep here project-related costs. And this leads us to our measure that I call overhead pool. So this measure simply calculates all the non-allocated expenses in our P&L, which then becomes the basis of our allocated overheads measure. So this measure takes that overhead pool value and then it allocates it to a given project based on our allocation share measure. So with those measures in place, we can now go back to our dashboard and then complete that monthly profit and loss matrix. So you see here in our setup that we're still using that total revenue measure, that total direct expenses measure. Then in addition to that, we have that allocated employee cost. Then we have our allocated overheads, then the total allocated costs, which if you click on that measure in the table to the right, which simply sums up all the allocated costs together. Then we have our project profit measure, which we call here our total profit, which takes the total revenue and subtracts from it total allocated costs. And then we have our billable hours, which was one of the base measures that we created earlier. Those measures, and especially that allocated overheads measure, allows us to create a profit and loss breakdown by project. So in that next matrix, I simply replace the rows with the project name, keeping all of the measures as they were. Now, if I go to that allocation basis slicer and change that basis to revenue, you see that the total profits stay the same, but some of the values for overheads and profit have changed accordingly. Now you see here that we can limit our analysis to a specific client. So for example, we can only look at that one client here. And then within the client, you can also select the project that you want to analyze. Finally, that cost allocation check is a multi-row card that I selected from our visuals with fields such as total allocated cost. So that's the measure that takes all the allocated costs plus direct expenses and adds them together. And then our allocation variance measure takes those allocated costs, subtracts from the total cost, and looks at the result. Now, if you see a 0 here, it means that there was no variance between the total allocated costs and the total cost from the P&L, which means that all those costs have been allocated correctly. Now, on the next page, staff contribution looks at the project revenue and cost contribution on an employee basis. So let's go back to my web tutorial, and then we'll scroll down to another step, step 6. And then here we have detailed measures behind those employee contribution metrics. So first of all, we need to create a new DAX table, this time calling this hour basis. So this table will have a column called basis with two values, billable hours or total hours. Below that, you see that we have that selected hour basis measure. That's the measure that effectively will link that slicer, which I call here revenue contribution basis, containing that values from the basis, from the hour basis table with those two values, so billable hours and total hours. And then this slicer then is linked to that measure here, selected hour basis. If no value is selected, then the billable hours is our default. In this measure, employees hour for share, if the slicer shows billable hours, then we're going to select billable hours measure, which is one of those base measures that we created earlier. Otherwise, we're going to pick the total hours. The next measure, project hours for share, simply sums up either billable or total hours across all employees working on a specific project. Then the next measure, employee share of project hours, looks at the percentage share of a given employee's hours on a given project. So it simply takes the total number of hours that an employee worked on a project, and then it divides it by the number of total hours that all of the employees contributed to a given project. And then the employee revenue contribution takes that employee hours for share measure that we created earlier. So this is where we selected whether we use billable or total hours. And then it uses that project hours for share measure, which is also one of the calculations that we created earlier, using those billable or total hours as the basis. And then it multiplies it by the total revenue from a given project. So with those measures and calculations in place, we can now create this first matrix. So we open our setup here. You see that in our rows, I simply added employee ID, and then I added measures with my billable hours, total hours, utilization, which simply takes the billable hours and divides it by total hours spent directly on projects. Then that employee revenue contribution measure, which is the measure that we just looked at, calculating the revenue contribution of each employee based on the share of hours that an employee worked on a given project. Then we have our employee costs, which is the measure that we created earlier when calculating our profit and loss. Then we have our revenue per hour, which simply takes that employee revenue contribution and then divides it by the number of total hours or billable hours, depending on our selection. Then we have our employee costs, which uses that staff hourly cost measure that takes that allocated employee cost and divides it by total number of hours or billable hours, depending on our selection. And then the gross margin per hour measure that simply takes that revenue per hour minus staff hourly costs. In addition to that, I've also added that tree map chart for my visuals, so I can analyze the project revenue per hour. So here I've added project field from the dim projects table as the category field. And then for my values, I simply added that revenue per hour measure. And then in this visual, which is the cluster bar chart that I've also added from our visual gallery, I've added the project field from the dim projects table to my y-axis, and then that gross margin per hour measure to my x-axis. So now we can see that if I switch my revenue contribution basis, let's say from billable hours to total hours, the numbers here slightly change as the basis of the revenue contribution calculations is slightly different. Finally, I've also added that revenue allocation check card. So here I'm showing that employee revenue contribution measure, and then I compare it to that total revenue measure, which simply sums up all the revenues for my P&L. And then the 0 in that allocation to P&L variance means that all the revenues have been allocated correctly. Now we can go back to my web tutorial, and then if you scroll down, you see that I've listed here all the remaining measures for our staff allocation analysis. And with those reports in place, we can now move on to our project cost and profitability forecast. Before we introduce our first DAX forecast measure, we need to create our parameters. If we go back to my dashboard and then click on that forecast page, you will see a set of sliders for revenue, salaries, the number of hours, direct expenses, and overhead adjustment. Each of the sliders is simply a slicer with a parameter field attached to it. So let's go back to my practice sheet and then we'll create that first revenue adjustment parameter. So I'm going to create a new page, and then while I'm on the report view, I'm going to click on the modeling tab, then select new parameter, and then choose numeric range. Let's call this parameter revenue percentage adjustment. And then for my data type, I'm going to select a decimal number because we're going to be dealing with percentages. For my minimum, I'm going to type in -1. And then for my maximum, I'll select 1. And then for my increment, I'm going to select 0.01 and then type in 0 for a default. So effectively, that means that our revenue percentage parameter will have a value of -1, so -100%, to +1, which is 100%. And we can change those values with the increment of 0.01, which is 1%. And then if no value is selected, the default will be 0. I'm going to unselect that add slicer to this page because that's something I'm going to do later, and then click create. And now you should see that revenue percentage adjustment parameter appearing in our data pane. If I want to add that slider, I'm going to go to insert, go to my visual gallery, and then select a slicer. And then as my field, I'm going to add data, go to my revenue percentage adjustment, and then select that first field. So now you can see that revenue percentage adjustment slicer with a slider inside. You will see that as I move that slider to the right, the value changes from -1 and it goes towards 1 with the increment of 0.01, which follows our setup. The last thing I want to do, I want to click on that parameter field and then go to my formatting, change it to percentages, and then also adjust maybe that decimal places. So now you see the value of the parameter is formatted as a percentage. So now if we go back to my dashboard, you will see that I've repeated that step 4 more times. So I can adjust my revenue, my salaries, the number of hours that need to be spent on our projects, direct expenses, and then the overall overheads. If we go back to my web tutorial, and again, you can find a link to this page at the description of this video, you will see that here I've listed those parameters with some suggested values. And then if we scroll down, here I've listed what I call forecast multipliers. So those will be the measures that will allow me to link those parameters to my forecast calculations. So for example, here for the revenue multiplier, I simply take the 1 plus that revenue percentage parameter value. Same thing with direct expenses, salaries, hours, and overhead. So now let's scroll to our first forecast measures. And then you will see that a lot of those measures mirror our baseline measures and the allocation measures that we created for our actuals. So for example, in order for me to calculate the total hours forecast, I simply have to take the total hours measure that we created earlier and then multiply it by that hours multiplier that we just looked at. Same thing with the billable hours. Take the number of billable hours that we created earlier, and then I multiply by the hours multiplier. That allows me to calculate that utilization percentage forecast, which simply takes the billable hours and divides it by the total hour forecast. For my total revenue, I take my total revenue measure and then multiply it by that revenue multiplier. And then similarly, for the total direct expenses, I also take those total direct expenses measure and then multiply it by that direct expenses multiplier. And then finally, I have my total salaries. So for the total salaries, I take the salaries from my P&L and multiply it by that salaries multiplier. For the unallocated salaries, I do the same thing, but this time applying that multiplier to the unallocated salaries. And then here I have my other non-direct costs, to which I apply my overhead multiplier. And now we can look at the allocation. So for example, in order to calculate forecast or revise allocated employee costs, we need to take our base allocated employee cost and then multiply it by that salaries multipliers, but also by the hours multiplier. Because the hours multiplier indicates their then we need to increase the number of hours spent on a given project, and the salaries multiplier indicates the increase in costs. Now, in order to calculate the hours share for the forecast, we'll still use the same logic as in our actual measure, but this time we want to take the total hours forecast spent on a given project as our numerator, and then the total hours forecast for the all projects as our denominator. In other words, we want to divide the number of project forecast hours by the total number of hours spent on all of the projects. Similarly, for the revenue share, we want to take that revised forecast revenue that we generate from a given project and then divided by the total forecast revenue that we generate from all of the projects in order to calculate the percentage revenue share of a given project. And then the similar logic follows for our allocation shares measure. So depending on the value of the slicer for the allocation, whether it's hours or revenue, we will apply one of the two measures from above. Now we need to recalculate our overhead pool using our forecast or revised measures. And then we need to apply that allocation share forecast measure in order to correctly distribute the overhead cost across the projects. Then we have our total cost forecast calculation, and then finally our project profit forecast, which takes the total revenues minus those total allocated costs. So we go back to our dashboard. You see that above those parameters, I've also added a card with the revised KPIs. So here, if we go to our measures table and the forecast folder, you see that I start with the average billing per hour, which is simply the total revenue divided by billable hours. And then again, you can adjust the label of each field by right-clicking on its name and then selecting the rename for this visual. For the project staff cost, I use that project staff cost per hour measure, which as you can see here, it takes the allocated employee costs and divides it by billable hours. Then for that overheads plus expenses measure, I simply sum up allocated overheads and total direct expenses and then divide those by billable hours. And then I have my total cost per hour measure, which simply takes that total revised cost and divides it by billable hours. And then finally, I have my project profit per hour, which takes that revised project profit and then also divides it by billable hours. Okay, so those measures give me my KPIs. And then below, you see that I have a cluster bar chart, which compares the actual project profit versus the forecast or revised profit. You can see that at the moment, all those bars are equal and the variance, and there's a zero variance between our actuals and forecast. But if I start adjusting those parameters here, so if, for example, if I increase the revenue by 5%, you will see that my KPIs change, and then also there's a difference between my actual and forecast profit. The numbers here, the negative numbers here are our variances. So if you click on that chart and go to our format pane, you'll see that if I click on data labels, and then select forecast for my series, select show for this series, and then scroll down. As my value, I selected that project profit variance, actual versus forecast, which simply subtract that project profit actual value from that project profit forecast measure, which in our case results in that negative number. And that's the value that's being displayed next to that forecast bar. So with the revised lower revenues, our profitability decreases. Now we can see what happens, for example, if we increase our salaries by 5%. So that's the salaries cost apply across our projects. You see that our profitability decreased even further. Now let's say that we underestimated the number of hours that we need to spend on our projects. So let's increase that value also by 5%. And then suddenly you see that some of the projects, that beta retail here, becomes actually loss making. Now that matrix to the right simply sums up those revised totals on a project basis. So you see here that you have those forecast revenues, direct expenses, allocated staff cost, overheads, total cost and profit that we created a few moments ago. And then similar to our profit and loss page, you can also select the allocation basis, whether it's hours or revenue, and then select the year. Now, if you go back to my tutorial, you'll see that here I covered this dashboard in more detail. I've also listed that variance measure and also those KPIs measures that we use to create our performance metrics. And then after the recap, you see that here I've also included a preview of the dashboard so you can test it and play with it on your own. And then on that final forecast page, you can also change those parameters and then see their impact on the overall profitability of the projects.
I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you'd like to download the dashboard or want to learn more about data analytics, follow the links in the description of this video, or if you have any questions, leave a comment below. To get in touch with me directly, go to my website at www.challengejp.com. Thank you very much.